So just to introduce our group a little more, we're the Austin Climate Coalition. We're made up of a bunch of local Austin environmental groups, as you can see on the screen there. And some of our goals of these webinars include like recognizing and unlearning the white superiority complex of the environmental movement. And we just want to basically educate the Austin community about the history of environmental racism while also kind of amplifying and uplifting a lot of the Black, Indigenous people of color in our community who often don't get their demands and teachings listened to. We also just want to make sure we're reforming our own groups and making sure that we're supporting these BIPOC groups with all of our resources we can. So just to give us a little example, that one in November, the webinar we hosted was about raising Indigenous voices and their perspective on the climate crisis. And so we're hoping to continue our efforts in more of these webinars. And so with this webinar today, we're trying to make sure we're reaching all of our goals as well.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to take this moment to acknowledge the traditional and ancestral territories of the Apache, the Alabama Coushatta Tribe of Texas, the Kickapoo Tribe of Texas, the Isleta del Sur Pueblo, the Lipan Apache Tribe, the Texas Band of Yaqui Indians, and the Cohuitican, which many of us are virtually gathering on today if you're in the Austin area. It's important for us to recognize the living history of these territories that we're on and their rightful owners in order to join in the fight against the systems of oppression that have deprived Indigenous and original people of their land and their rights to self-determination. With today's speaker series, we're really seeking to understand our responsibility as environmental organizations and activists in the fight for all social justice.
Oh, I think Bob is busy. Oh, sorry, Bob. Hello. All right, sorry, you're muted.
Okay, I got myself unmuted. I just quickly was giving a call to Shane, but he says he's here. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Shane and Kaiba. Shane, a clean energy organizer for the Sierra Club, is extremely qualified to discuss this topic, as he's the co-chair of the steering committee for the Austin Climate Equity Plan that synthesized the work of over 100 other people who crafted this plan. I've been very active in climate work, and I don't know a single climate activist better suited to talk about environmental justice and equity as a board member for Invisible Austin, and especially his leadership with the premier Austin organization fighting for criminal justice reform and Black empowerment. He's also worked for Solar Austin, Earth Day Austin, C5, and is a member of Austin's Resources Management Commission. Kaiba White is a stalwart of Austin energy policy. She also served on the steering committee for the Austin Climate Equity Plan and was a co-crafter of the Equity Tool. She is an energy expert with Texas Public Citizen and has helped craft many Austin resolution and plans around energy and the climate. She helped craft the last two Austin Energy Next Generation plans, maybe the last three, which have and will cut further our carbon footprint from electricity generation. She served on the Austin Resources Management Commission and other city groups and helped organize various events, including the Austin Climate March and other protests. She's a huge asset for the climate movement in Austin. I'm delighted to introduce my friends and colleagues, Kaiba White and Shane Johnson.
Thank you, Bob. All right, should we kick it off? I can start sharing.
Yeah, go for it.
All right, great, thank you. Well, I'm really happy to be here. Spent a lot of time over a year now on this plan, so happy to share this work with all of you and hopefully have some good discussion about it. I'm going to put this on full screen. Let me know if it doesn't work. All right, are you seeing the presentation in full screen? All right, cool, thanks. Yeah, so I'm Kaiba White, I work for Public Citizen. I'm gonna start off with just a little bit of kind of overview of the plan, real high level. There's a lot in this plan, so if you want to know all the details, and I encourage you to do so, you know, you should read it. But at a real high level, this plan is a little different than the last one in that it really focuses on goals for the next 10 years. So we started from the beginning, just looking at, well, what is the urgent need? The urgent need is to take action in the next 5 to 10 years. And also, what is it really possible to plan for in terms of, you know, budget and just, you know, where you can have planning that can, I think, be controlled by people who are in control. Maybe has a negative connotation, but all of us as a community can have some control over things the next 5 to 10 years. To get much beyond that, and it's difficult. So that's why the 2030, but it doesn't mean that our action is envisioned to end in 2030. So just to make that clear. But the big thing that we're here to talk about today is the center on equity throughout the plan. And this really was a pivot from the previous plan. The Austin Community Climate Plan, adopted in 2015, did a lot. And there was a lot of great actions, strategies proposed in there. And some of those came to fruition, some of them haven't yet. But equity really was not centered. Some things maybe, you know, by chance would improve equity, but it just was not what the center of the conversation was. We wanted that to be different. So we wanted to target actions specifically for low-income communities and communities of color. We wanted to be cognizant of the gentrification challenges in our city and really focus on anti-displacement opportunities to both do something for climate change and the environment and also stop that displacement that's going on, and the just transition. So we have an economy right now that has benefited the few and made the rich richer, and has not benefited our environment, and it has got us where we are now, which is a climate crisis. So how do we do better as we take on climate change? How do we reduce emissions and make it possible for everybody in our community and, you know, hopefully globally to start getting a better, more fair, more equitable slice of the pie? And a lot of that does come in the form of jobs and making sure that those good jobs that are being created in clean energy and other kind of eco-friendly industries are going towards people who are maybe going to be displaced from other jobs that are going to be phased out, and also importantly going to people of color and low-income folks who have not benefited from our current system. So trying to raise up those who have been left behind as we make these systemic changes to our economy. And, you know, locally trying to prioritize benefits for the Eastern Crescent of Austin. That's where there are disproportionately more lower income residents and also more people of color. And so that was just kind of a geographic focus, but certainly that is not the only focus in terms of targeting, you know, kind of beneficial equity programs for people of color and low income that goes throughout the community. And then just trying to make sure that we are learning from the diversity that does exist here in our community. Sometimes it can be real easy to just keep hearing from the same people over and over again. So these were themes that we went into the plan with. And I just want to kind of touch right at the start of this plan. While it absolutely centers equity, it also centers robust climate action. And I think that's important to stay up front because it's not the case that you have to sacrifice one for the other. Climate justice means taking robust, rapid action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It also means being intentional about how you do that so that people of color, lower income members in our community, and throughout our society are able to benefit from reduced pollution and numerous other co-benefits, and also get a piece of that economic pie that I just talked about. So the big thing in this plan in terms of changing of goals is that previously we had a net zero by 2050 goal. That is now, assuming that council does adopt this plan, which I'm hopeful that they will, would be net zero by 2040, and prioritizing more emissions reductions in the near term, because we know that that is absolutely needed because of the state of our climate crisis. And also, as you'll see on this graph, that line goes below zero. And so that is recognizing the historical harm that we in our society have done, and recognizing that when it comes to climate change and the state of our climate, we are going to need negative emissions. So we did not take action quick enough. And so now we not only have to eliminate all the emissions that we can, we need to start planning for how we can actually suck carbon out of the atmosphere and sequester it in a safe way. And that, that can be done through technology, and also can be done through natural systems. We're almost certainly going to need some of both of that. And yeah, just, so that a little bit of the background, this was informed by both the IPCC and their most updated reports that indicate that we need more action quicker, and that's where you get the 2040, but also by the C40 Cities Deadline 2020 plan, which, kind of divides cities globally into high and low income and high and low emissions. And since as an American city, we are high income and also high emitting, that's where you end up with this curve, the black curve that you see there, which will be our emissions path that we're trying to get on. And, I will say we'll talk a little bit about some of the strategies later on, but we know that we're not on track even with this plan to get on that emissions reduction line. So we are going to need to go all in all sectors, reducing as much as possible, doing it in an equitable way. And even if we did everything in this plan perfectly, we know we still need to do more. So we will be coming back to the table and looking for new solutions. But that maybe is a conversation for another day. Today, we want to really focus on how did we do all this and do it in a way that really centered equity. So I'm going to turn it over to Shane to give a little bit of the background in terms of the Austin setting when it comes to racial injustice and that information that really informed how we went into the process.
Thanks, Kaiva. Hey, y'all, Shane Johnson, he, and pronouns. Thanks for having us. So I think what I'll be saying is essentially zooming out to a little bit of the broader context, but within the Austin area. So as I'm sure, or I hope all of you know, low-income communities and communities of color, and naturally low-income communities of color, are most disproportionately harmed by climate change impacts. Disproportionately losing livelihoods, homes, or their lives, things like that, and experience the worst climate shocks on top of course, also being more economically stressed. And then lower income folks, communities of color, have less resources to bounce back from any sort of emergency. And then on top of that, these are also can cause or exacerbate long-term mental health and physical health impacts from anything from higher temperatures that can cause things like heat stroke to intense flooding and rain, flash floods, obviously are really a problem in Austin. Increased wildfire risk, all of these things. And so you can go to the next slide. And with all of that and the COVID pandemic, that alone is, you know, with the climate crisis is hard enough, but I think we've obviously seen in the last week really starting to see the true extent and scale of white supremacy in the US and how much this is fundamentally connected to all of these other issues we're talking about. And so in the climate plan, we decided to center racial equity, which essentially racial equity means quality of life is no longer determined by your race, which is the single strongest predictor, more so than gender, income, anything else in this country, because the US, as we saw today, is a white supremacist country in terms of our history and our past and our present. And that is certainly not exclusive of Austin. Austin is, in some ways, chief in terms of some of the worst examples of white supremacy in the entire US. Back in 1928, the city was had racial segregation sort of more strongly codified by the 1928 master plan that divided Austin along what was at the time called East Avenue, and then was paved over and expanded to become I-35 in the 50s when the highway system was created by the federal government. And then on the east side, where you can see the yellow, orange, green, and brown dots that represent people of color. And in that part of Austin is where any sort of toxic hazard was placed, such as the 1928 tank farms, where that stored petroleum and oil and were causing really toxic air and water pollution, higher cancer rates, all of that in East Austin, until organizers really rose up and fought that back and then forced the city to push out the tank farms. Nowadays we have gentrification, which many people are privileged and don't see that, but that's certainly not the case if you're a person of color on the east side of Austin. Austin is the only major city in the US that has lost its African American or Black population in terms of absolute numbers, not just as a percentage. We're the only major city in modern history and currently to have lost and be losing our Black population. And it's really a marker of how bad the sort of systematic racism and white supremacy is, specifically in the city of Austin. 27% of Black folks are homeowners, 32% of Latinx folks are homeowners, while 52% of white Austin residents own their homes. And then on top of all of this, you add the COVID pandemic, which is, as I'm sure you've all heard, killing and harming Black and brown people first and worst. And this continues even now with vaccine rollout for the COVID-19 vaccine. The vast majority of COVID-19 vaccines are being administered on the west half of Boston, even though the virus is affecting the east side much worse. And so all of these things play into how our city runs, how our society operates in Central Texas, and then thus how people are able to or not able to respond to climate change while they're also being hurt worse by climate change. And so naturally we have to take that into account in this climate plan. And I'll also add this in, the more involved you get in policy, the more you learn that land use is sort of king of all issues. That's where wealth and money, most wealth is derived from. And so land use is extremely important for all of these issues and addressing climate change. And most land is in the city is owned by wealthy corporations or wealthy people. And that's exacerbating all of these issues. And then there's more competition for land with gentrification and rising prices that sort of compounds all of these other issues. And I'll just take one more second to add that you can't separate white supremacy from cis heteropatriarchy, from the oppression of women, non-binary folks, trans folks. You can't separate it from economic justice, from the oppression that our capitalist society is placing on low-income people. And so we all have to take all of these issues into account if we want to actually succeed in pushing for equity. So next slide. And that's sorry, that's sweet, Kaida. So this is all really important.
Somehow I thought you had another slide, but.
Yeah, I think because we changed the order actually. But yeah, so this is all why we have to be centering equity. And then from there, Kaiba's now going to discuss sort of how that came about in terms of the city processes and the development of this climate plan process.
Thanks, Shane. So I think as Bob mentioned, I serve as the chair for the Joint Sustainability Committee. And that is a committee that is made up primarily of representatives of a number of other boards and commissions that serve the city in an advisory capacity on a variety of issues, but all of them could or do in some way touch on the environment. And so each of them sends a member to the Joint Sustainability Committee. So we by nature are, very kind of, interdimensional. We're made up of people who have specialties in a bunch of different areas, but climate change brings us together. And the purpose, the mission of the Joint Sustainability Committee is implementation of the Austin Community Climate Plan. Presumably that mission will, be to implement the Austin Climate Equity Plan once it is adopted. But this was a scheduled update. And so early on, probably about almost 2 years ago now, we first started having, just kind of initial updates from the Office of Sustainability. There will be an update coming, we'll be establishing a process, and we started engaging in those conversations with Zach and his team at the Office of Sustainability. And real early on, we identified that equity needed to be a priority and needed to really be the center of that planning process. And so we got the equity office involved, and I think that was absolutely key. And so, for those of you who might be engaged in some other aspects of planning in Austin or with other city governments, I think the biggest takeaway for me with this is it really makes a difference to start with that equity frame right from the beginning. Don't try to, just muddle forward and then, if it doesn't quite go the way you think it should, come in and try to like layer on equity as a frosting on top. It really needs to be baked into the cake. And that's what we did here. And I think that while there is still plenty that can be improved on, it does speak to why there was success, is having Brian Oakes and his team at the Equity Office assisting us in thinking through what an equitable structure was and, and specifically how to recruit and think about the timelines for the plan in a way that would be equitable. So how did we do this? First of all, we were intentional. We did not just kind of wing it. We really thought about what was it that we wanted to achieve. We being a subgroup of the Joint Sustainability Committee, Equity Office staff, and Office of Sustainability staff. We wanted broad community engagement, which is not an easy thing to achieve. And I would say that perhaps we haven't really achieved it with this plan. I think we have done better, but I think that's an area that we will need to continually improve upon. But that was our intention. And the other thing was to have extra representation from people of color on the steering committee and the 5 advisory groups. And by extra, I mean more than their proportional representation in the Austin community. And we wanted that because we know that disproportionately we hear from white folks, and specifically often from upper to middle income white folks. So how do you start to overcome, that inherent inequity? You have to intentionally bring more people of color to the table. And, we recognize that there are barriers, there are reasons, numerous reasons why people of color aren't always at the table. Sometimes it has been because they haven't been invited. Sometimes it's that the space has not felt friendly and inviting, even if they were invited. And then there's other barriers as well. And for lower income folks, especially, just having the time and being able to dedicate time to these kind of efforts on a volunteer basis can be a real barrier. Like, I feel very lucky that I am paid to do this work. Shane is paid to do this work, but a lot of the people that you see showing up for these kind of public meetings or at City Hall, they're doing it, as good citizens, as volunteers, and that's great. It's nothing that they should feel bad about, that we should feel bad about, but how do we get other people to be able to have that same opportunity? How do we make it a more diverse representation? And part of that is by providing funding for those who cannot do it on a volunteer basis, but have something to contribute. And so we, one of the things that we came up with in those conversations was the idea for climate ambassadors. And this actually was something we sort of borrowed from San Antonio. They hadn't been climate ambassadors, but they had used something called the promotores, and they primarily were out in the community talking to folks about health related issues. And the idea here is to identify people who are already connected in their communities, who are, doing community organizing, perhaps paid through an organization or perhaps on a volunteer basis, and to capitalize on those connections and that trust that they're already building with our diverse community, and actually pay them for doing this work. And so you can see here on, I guess it's the left, this group of folks is most, I think there's maybe 2 missing from that photo of the climate ambassadors that were recruited and paid to go out and have community conversations and interviews and report back what folks were experiencing in the community in terms of their struggles and barriers to accessing some of the things that we're talking about in the climate plan, and also to inform them about this planning process, because a lot of times people don't even know that we're going through various city planning processes until it's well over, if even then. So that was a key thing, and I'm going to come back to that a little bit. The other thing was making sure to be intentional about recruiting, and Shane is going to talk about that a little bit more, but I'll just say that, we identified that we needed to have buy-in from, key partners, community organizations, and individuals to help us reach more people of color, because if you just use your organic network and you're starting from a base of white people, we know that that will get you mostly more white people. And so we needed to, get that assistance from some of the community partners that have been engaged. And the other, I think, important element was the climate equity workshops that everybody that was part of this process was asked to do. And that really just grounded us in some of the facts, some of the stuff that Shane talked about right up front, that history and current situation with racial injustice in our community, and kind of also establishing some, shared expectations and language, and just somewhere to build from as we went through the process. It wasn't a full, everybody didn't come out of there fully enlightened because it was one day and we did the best that we could, but it was it was a way to kind of kick that off. Yeah, so just wanted to talk a little bit more about the climate ambassadors. And the reason I'm going to spend a little moment on this is I see this as something that we can really take forward into the future. In this case, the climate ambassadors got started, after the steering committee had already been meeting. We had envisioned it right up front, but it wasn't until I think probably at least a couple months in that they were actually getting going. So I think that that's, a shortcoming that I would identify. Ideally, that community engagement, I think, would have happened or at least started before the planning process even got underway, so that we would have some information to build from. But now that we have done this once, hopefully the next time around that can be done in advance as well as throughout the plan. So as I mentioned, their purpose was to go out and facilitate community meetings and conduct interviews. A lot of this ended up having to, be done remotely because of COVID, but they did still persist, which I think is excellent. And, they were out there trying to identify where there's concerns, where there's barriers, and where there's opportunities. And all of this, work was intended to feed into how we're coming up with strategies and goals in the plan. And I think it did to a certain extent, but it's my hope that it's something that would be, I think, more impactful if it were at least done in advance of the plan. But really, I think this is work that should be happening all the time. I think that this should be a permanent part of our city government paying, even if it's just on a part-time basis, community organizers, specifically people of color, to go out there and engage with the community. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. Shane is going to go into kind of more of what we did once the steering committee was actually established and we got into more of our work.
Thanks, Kaiva. Thanks, Kaiva. So yeah, to build on what Kaiva was saying, so there's so much, there's so many layers to it, and so much work done behind the scenes to lay the groundwork. So dozens of city staff involved, 120 community members. So there was city staff and community members making up each of the sort of their advisory groups that then basically gave technical advice and framing to the steering committee, and the steering committee synthesized that and helped ensure to center equity in that. But in the process, we spent a month and a half, 2 months, contacting people, recruiting folks, and actually even before I was involved at all in the steering committee, I was collaborating with Celine, who is the Office of Sustainability's outreach specialist, who essentially led the community engagement on this plan and did a phenomenal job. And quite frankly, it's because Celine has a background in community organizing and student activism when she was at UT, and community engagement work after, and connection to communities of color in Austin once she left the university. If they hadn't hired her or somebody like her with that experience, this plan would not have gone nearly as well as it did, because we need to be centering community engagement, community organizing that's already happening in communities led by the people who are most impacted by these issues. And largely, and that's also my background as an organizer. And so between Celine and I, like, we have either direct or indirect contacts with dozens and dozens of organizations, and we've just invited so many different community members of color, primarily first, to sort of flip the previous models of any sort of climate plan or environmental plan in Austin on its head, where in the past has often just been, as Kaiva was saying, more affluent and white folks. And we very intentionally also really centered community members, individuals, or community leaders, both nonprofits and community groups that aren't actually a formal nonprofit organization. And that's who we needed to prioritize and did prioritize in terms of being a member of an advisory group or the steering committee, especially over the business community, over the chambers, over large companies, and also over large nonprofit organizations that have always had a seat at the table. And that was really, really key to actually being able to practice equity, was that we had to, from the very beginning, have the right approach to get the right people in the room. And that's what we did. And then on top of all that, as Kaiba touched on, there were 4 equity trainings, and every single participant was required to go through an equity training. And it was so key to get everybody on the same page with the same foundational knowledge of what is equity, why is racial equity so important to this plan and any work that we want in Austin to be transformative and to actually win on climate change. Because quite frankly, there were people who walked into the equity trainings and they're like, I don't understand why I have to be here. I feel uncomfortable talking about race. Why are we talking about race? This is a climate change issue. And now, then by the end of that, their eyes were open and they really started to understand why this is so much more complex and fundamentally is a race issue. Climate change is a race issue, and if people don't understand that, they'll never be able to truly address climate change. So next slide. Thanks. And in that same vein, we, in trying to practice centering equity, we, as I was saying, prioritize racial equity because this country is founded on race and racism, and it affects every other issue. And so we couldn't just have sort of, the way I like to say it is like trickle down carbon reduction, where we just reduce carbon emissions through energy efficiency, renewables, electric vehicles, planting trees, greater green space, things like that. And getting people off their cars if they are privileged enough to not have to use a car. But we are also really shifted this to look at, how can people be safe at all times? And that means safe from harassment, safe from being brutalized or killed by other people, including the police, safe from, as I touched on earlier, disproportionate economic harms where low-income people and people of color don't have savings and are one emergency away from crisis, and inclusive participation in the city. And that's, one bullet point, but it's probably the most complex topic in this list, because the inclusivity, to truly be inclusive, you have to have trust. And the community certainly doesn't trust a lot of the city. And rightfully so. We still have some of the worst de facto segregation in the city of Austin in the entire country, in any major city. The city hasn't addressed a lot of racism and white supremacy, so why should communities of color trust them? There are low-income folks who have never been helped by the city, so why should the city trust them without building that trust? Another layer to that, I would say, is cultural competency, to be able to work multiculturally and across languages. If the city was only offering one language or just English and Spanish, there are so many people who speak Chinese, Vietnamese, Arabic, Urdu, Hindi, other languages that we have to have access. And then out of the intersection of these areas came 7 main themes of basically how we can prioritize and center equity in this climate work. And those were health, affordability, accessibility, cultural preservation, community capacity, just transition, and accountability. Okay, next slide. So, some of these are self-explanatory, but These also are very multifaceted issues. So affordability, lowering and stabilizing cost of living, that's fundamentally one of the most complex issues in Austin, because we're one of the fastest gentrifying cities, and there's I've seen almost nobody who really has any. There is no one size fits all solution to gentrification, and it's really hard to address. As Caillou was touching on, just transition, we have to transition away from the fossil industry and other industries. I mean, we also, to address the climate crisis, similarly, and especially if we're looking at the intersections with race, we have to transition away from policing as much as possible. And we certainly have to transition away and close any sort of private prisons that are just inherently immoral, things like that. And those are, for better or for worse, that is how our society is currently running. That is how some people are making a living, and people shouldn't be harmed or left by the wayside because they were forced into, and their only option for a job is something that is harmful to society, and society is shifting away from it. And then on top of that, being multicultural, like I was saying, we have to honor the past history of different communities and the cultures they have, and in order to be able to really humanize one another, bring us all together, build that trust that we have to have in order to collaborate to address these issues, and in order to be able to center equity. So these are all interlocking and have to all be addressed simultaneously. And then the next slide is equity tool process. So the way the process, or the way our climate plan update structure works was, as I briefly mentioned earlier, there were several different advisory groups. There are 5 advisory groups on electric vehicles, transportation and land use, consumption, excuse me. Why am I forgetting the rest? Wow, I just completely drew a blank. Go ahead.
Sustainable buildings and natural resources. Sustainable
buildings and natural resources. Thank you. And also, we have to, in each area, there are so many different solutions. Some of them would be prioritizing equity. Some would be sort of equity blind, which may or may not be bad. And then some would, of course, be harmful in terms of equity, or might be institutionally racist, and we can't be doing those things. And so we have to take all of that into consideration. And also, as I touched on really briefly earlier, land use is king in any sort of policy. And so some of the solutions for different climate change related issues will have the same costs or the same resource needs, and we only have a limited amount of resources, and we have to figure out, if there are 4 different solutions that all require public land for that solution, then we can't do all of those necessarily at the same time, or maybe we can do them all, but you have to do them in a specific order. And what I really want to press on for this equity tool process is that, as I said earlier, we have, and like Haiba said, we have to lead with equity in every step of the process, because we have to get the right people in the room to be able to really understand and center equity. And then even once we got the right people in the room and we had the right intentions of centering equity, it still took a lot of discussion and debate and work to bring everybody onto the same page. And this equity tool would not have been developed without several Black women who are in the rooms, in particular, really pushing on this front. And then I would say being supported by Latinx women in the room. It was really Black and brown women who truly made this possible and made it the best that it could be for our city. And so basically, in order this is to determine whether or not a strategy in the plan would be, as I was saying, sort of harmful or equity blind or helpful. And the first step is like, what is the history and where are inequities? We need to be taking that into consideration. We have to gather as much data as we can realistically, and what does that data tell us? Then does the goal include both a climate and an equity component? And then from there, with all three of those foundational pieces, develop strategies with equity and historical context in mind. And then from there, evaluate, does the strategy meet our shared values? And centering equity, trying to be more anti-racist, things like that, and different communities' needs that may be competing. And then from there, we would reevaluate as needed once we've taken that into account and see, do we need to actually look back at the step more to the earlier parts of the equity tool. And then lastly, how can we ensure accountability and communicate results overall? So this, as I was saying, came from Black and Brown women. I did my best to support them as well, and really make sure that we would have this tool to use throughout the process. And I'll reiterate also that the structure, as you're saying, is there are 5 advisory groups advising the steering committee, and so it's best if they are evaluating for equity, first, and then the steering committee is a second layer or a second step of the process, also evaluating for equity. It would have made it so much harder if only the steering committee was doing that. And so this is a tool really essential that the steering committee crafted specifically for the advisory groups to use. And now Kaila will walk us through some examples of using this tool.
Yeah, thanks, Shane.
Yeah.
So the advisory groups really were doing the bulk of the work in coming up with those specific goals and strategies for those 5 areas. And so like Shane said, it made sense for those groups to be the ones using this tool. And again, here is an area where I think we're poised to do better next time than we did this time, in that the steering committee had to create this tool and we wanted to get it right, so we took our time. But that meant that the advisory groups were simultaneously meeting and starting their work before this tool was ready. I think ideally, and hopefully this will be the case next time around, those groups will have this tool right from the start. And so even before they start to contemplate what goals or strategies they might want to explore, they will be doing that data collection and establishing those kind of principles that, what do we want to achieve, as opposed to, strategies to get there. But I do think that this still played a strong role, and I personally participated in a couple of those advisory groups. The steering committee members were invited to attend any of those meetings. In fact, really anybody who wanted to sit in on those meetings and participate was able to do so, which I think was great. So, I saw firsthand that, yeah, by and large, people were willing to reconsider. It did take a little bit of work to kind of get into the questions and really think through, well, does this strategy, does it benefit equity, or maybe it just does nothing, or in some cases, maybe there are potential negative consequences. And the intention of the tool was not so much just to say, well, this is a good strategy or that is a bad strategy, and so we should do the good strategies and not do the bad strategies. It was more, how can we retool all of the strategies that maybe aren't as good as we want them to be when it comes to equity, to make them better. And that doesn't necessarily mean that every single strategy is a home run when it comes to equity, but it means that we've been intentional about trying to identify where barriers exist and how those barriers might be able to be overcome. So if there is, maybe a cost or access barrier in some program that we're considering for a strategy, what can we do to eliminate that? Or should a couple strategies kind of be paired together so that while one strategy might work okay for higher income folks, maybe a different strategy needs to make sure that it has at least equal, weight and focus so that lower income people are able to access something similar. And I think that that kind of like flexible approach was helpful, because it meant that instead of, just feeling like you needed to defend your strategy if it was something you liked, it was really about problem solving. And, that's a kind of more helpful place to be in as you do this work, that we're all in it together trying to come up with the best solutions to both reduce emissions as quickly as possible and make our community more equitable. And, I do think that we partially achieved that in this plan. I don't think that we did everything perfectly, but I do want to share a few examples, one from each of the 5 groups that I think highlights, how equity was definitely coming through and does come through. And these are not by any means the only examples, but I just wanted to pick some to share. So sustainable buildings is where I'm going to start, partially because I participated in a lot of the conversations as part of this advisory group. And first of all, I'll say, it's sustainable buildings because a lot of our energy production issues are already kind of being dealt with through Austin Energy transitioning to renewable energy. So this group is really focused on the built environment and also in how that intersects with energy use, with water use, and I guess also the actual materials that go into buildings. So in the first, in this case, I'm going to highlight one strategy that falls under goal 1. Each of the goals have several strategies that are laid out to show how we can reach the goal. In this case, the first strategy is explicitly to ensure the benefits flow to low-income communities and communities of color. And as you'll see here, it really is focused on working with community organizations as well as others in the community to reach that goal. So this is one where, on the face of it, it looks like, well, there's still the work is still to be done. That's absolutely true. This plan is not an implementation plan. This is a vision. And so this strategy really highlights that our vision is to do this work of making our buildings more energy efficient, to do that in a way that also improves equity. So we're going to need to build these partnerships, and you'll see here the future climate ambassadors are mentioned, and I hope that does come to fruition, and those climate ambassadors can really help us do that work of engaging the community in a meaningful way, because I think that, where we are now is that we've just started to scratch the surface of doing that the right way, and we're going to need, frankly, years of that kind of engagement to really get to the place where this plan envisions us going. And you'll see here also mentioned, city departments working together and working with stakeholders. You see trees and greenery utilized. That's something that we'll come back to in another strategy that I want to highlight. And using these mechanisms to cut costs for households and make sure that low-income communities are not disproportionately kind of burdened by this transition. So this is one example on sustainable buildings, and the goal here is to reduce energy use in buildings through decarbonization. The next one that I wanted to focus on is in the food and product consumption area, and this is actually, I think, an area that warrants just a note that it actually is a whole new section in the climate plan that didn't exist in our previous plan. Consumption emissions are substantial but difficult to quantify, but every single thing that we use, your phone, your computer, your desk, your bed, all of those, have embedded emissions within them. And so this group was tasked with coming up with solutions to help shift away from high impact goods towards lower impact goods and services. And that's a challenging thing. It was broken into a few sections, food being one of them, commercial kind of activities, large businesses, and then more individual activities as a third one. Here under this goal, you see a strategy that is focused on workforce development. And I do think that this is, a strong theme that you see in the plan, and this kind of workforce and just transition is one of the kind of cross-cutting strategies that if you read the plan, you'll see that called out right in the beginning. And it's because in several sections, you'll see workforce development as a strategy. And it's because it offers a great co-benefit to our city. We can be reducing emissions, we can be improving sustainability, and we can also be putting people to work in hopefully good paying jobs that are local here in Austin. And this one prioritizes the needs and strengths of low-income communities, youth, and communities of color as we make that transition into the circular economy. Circular economy just means that instead of using goods and then moving them on to the landfill, that they are in some way being recycled, reused, put back into service. And I will say that this section does focus primarily not just on how do we divert waste, but how do we actually eliminate that waste. So it's not just, do I put this in the trash or do I put it in the compost or the recycling? It's how do I avoid using so many products that have to go into one of those bins in the first place? How do we use more durable goods? How do we use fewer goods? What is it that we actually need? And frankly, you can start to create a lot of local jobs when you start thinking about repairing things instead of just buying something new that is maybe manufactured somewhere far away.
Just a reminder to our speakers very briefly that we have about 3 or 4 minutes left of speaking time before we allow for a short 5-minute Q&A.
Okay. Thank you. Those are the two I want to spend the most time on, but I do want to share these other 3 real quickly. In transportation and land use, there's a lot in this section, but you'll see in here a whole goal is focused on affordable housing. And when it comes to gentrification, obviously affordability is a huge problem, and so I think it's great that this was reiterated in this plan. Transportation electrification, I think, was probably the most challenging section of the plan in terms of achieving our equity goals. And I say that for a couple of reasons. It was the most challenging when it came to recruiting people of color. And also just because, electric vehicles have traditionally been a more expensive option that's now starting to change. But also just the car ownership in and of itself is, it's not equitable. Those of us with more means, with higher incomes, are able to own cars, and those on the lower income scale are not able to even own a car, let alone consider an electric car. So I think that's why this strategy stuck out to us, is something like e-bikes and electric car sharing actually does start to make those technologies accessible to lower income parts of our community. Natural systems, this is a section, another totally new section in this plan, and it's focused primarily on the opportunity to sequester carbon locally through our natural systems, through farming, through tree planting and the like. This goal I particularly like because it recognizes the need to focus tree planting in low-income communities and communities of color. There's been plenty of research that shows that there's just a lot more trees in higher income communities. And, you know, I'm sure anybody who has driven around town has seen this even in Austin, that, you know, you go to West Austin and those big homes and the rolling hills, and there's trees all over. And, you know, there's real benefits to having that. There's better, you know, physical health benefits in terms of air quality and noise, and it's better for your mental well-being. And, you know, when it comes to climate change, having more trees is a real help when it comes to urban heat island effect. So I just wanted to highlight this one for that reason. I'm going to turn it back over to Shane. Hope you'll be a little bit lenient on the end time so that he can share a few kind of wrap up notes and some items for action.
Thanks, Kaiba. Yeah, and I'll skim through these a little bit faster then. So yeah, like Kaiba was describing and touched on, the climate plan is the product of a trusted and very longer term than expected process of co-creating with hundreds of community members, literally hundreds of community members and dozens of staff in the city. It's aggressive, but it's realistic. This is what's needed according to the climate science and the needs of community members, and the needs to address racism and white supremacy in this country as well. But these are what we need to be able to actually beat climate change. And if we don't center racial equity, we will never win on climate change, no matter what we do. And you know, this is a visionary attempt to complement existing city plans and chart new goals. So there's 5 or 6 other recent city policy plan updates that all will interact with this climate plan. I would say this is the best in terms of centering equity. This climate plan is far and away better than any other city plan that the city of Austin has ever done. And so this is a good standard for other plans. And since we have developed this equity tool and process, other city planning and other departments can start doing this now. And then, you know, it's not exhaustive, and it's not exact, and it's not prescribing you need to do these strategies in this order or invest this much amount in these strategies. That's something that we'll need to figure out as a community going forward. But like Kaiba was describing, it's really key that we build relationships and that we do this collaboratively, because the best way for any city process and the staff involved and council members to be held accountable is to have built relationships with the community. Otherwise, we won't be able to practice the equity that we talk about centering. Next slide. And yeah, this process has taken over a year when it was initially supposed to take 6 months, and that's the type of work and commitment you have to have in centering equity. We presented to 24 boards and city boards and commissions, a month of public comment, and then lastly, we're aiming for a council vote in late March after a couple of delays and other delays with the election. And so keep your eyes peeled around March. And then our last slide. So in the meantime, there's plenty to be doing. You know, keep doing the work y'all are doing in this group. And actually tomorrow, the Texas Sierra Club, which is I'm a staff member before, is doing a Texas legislature training on essentially a deeper look into the legislative process and fundamentals of the state budget. And after doing I'm a native Austinite, but I've been organizing here after graduating from college for several years. And what I've found is that there are unfortunately a lot of major issues that the city legally cannot do anything about because the state has stopped them. And so there are many, many important things that we have to address at the state legislature. And the state legislature session just started. So we have about It's kind of crazy, but we have about 5 months for the next 2 years to inform that process. And then, as always, we should be supporting Black-led and other organizations led by people of color. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having us.